Together once again. If you're watching us online, glad you've joined us that way. And before I get into my sermon, I wanted to give you some exciting news. We have been looking for a while now to have somebody come alongside of Dom Massa and help him with our student ministries as it begins to grow. And so we have been looking for a staff member to join us, and we have officially hired a guy named Logan Ritz. And Logan and his wife, Olivia, are right here with us today for their first Sunday. So would you guys stand and would you welcome them? Awesome. Great to have you guys. Logan and Liv got married 6 months ago? Yeah. So it's awesome. What a great way to start off your marriage being with us here. We're excited to have them. If you can, after the service too, make sure you greet them and welcome them here. All right. So this is week 2 of our little mini sermon series called For the Neighborhood. And in this series, the For the Neighborhood is actually kind of one of our taglines. It's on the wall out there because we really desire as a church not just to be the kind of church where we expect people to come here to hear about Jesus. We want to be the kind of church that takes Jesus out there into our homes, into our neighborhoods, into our workplaces to share Him with others. What I want this church to do is to feel like wherever you live right now, did you ever think that you bought the house or you live in the apartment that you live in, not because it was just a nice place with a nice yard and a great place to raise your kids, but maybe you live where you live because God has positioned you there because someone needs to hear about Jesus. And I think that's the way God works. Another way to say this is, what if you are living where you live because you have a neighbor whose life is going to be changed forever? Right? That's the way we want to see this series. That's kind of perspective that we want to have here. Now, to drive this point home in this series, we're actually using and looking at the book of Jonah, or the story of Jonah. It's a very familiar story to a lot of people. It is a short story, only 4 chapters, but it is wild. It's crazy. So Pastor Dan last week launched this series and talked about Jonah chapters 1 and 2. Today we're going to be in chapters 3 and 4. But I want to recap very quickly what Pastor Dan said last week and kind of the story of Jonah up until this point. Very familiar to a lot of us, but bear with me real quick. All right. God calls a man named Jonah to go to Nineveh to tell Nineveh to turn from their evil and turn to God. Jonah wants nothing to do with it. He hops a boat going the opposite direction. God sends a storm to get his attention, so they throw him into the sea to stop the storm because Jonah would rather die than actually stay on the boat and turn around and go to Nineveh. But while he is ebbing away to his death, a huge fish grabs Jonah, swallows him whole, and he sits in the belly of a whale for 3 days until God finally gets his attention. He is sorry, the fish spits him out onto dry land, and he gets a second chance to go to Nineveh. That's where we pick up today. And we're talking about this in here. Our kids are doing this back in our kids' ministry. And I just think it's kind of funny because when we do with kids' ministry, they're like, oh, Jonah and the whale, it's going to be perfect for our kids to hear. And there are other things we think are inappropriate for a kid. But listen to this. Jonah is not necessarily this really fun story to tell our kids. Listen, Jonah is running away from God in disobedience. In the middle of the storm, says, hey, throw me into the sea because I want to die. Then he is ebbing away, and this giant sea creature swallows him whole, and he sits not knowing if he's ever going to come out of the whale again. And we're like, oh, the kids are going to love this one, right? I mean, your kids might have some nightmares. I don't know. And I was looking up, when you just Google Jonah and the whale, pictures like this come up. Can you put that picture up? Even when you put a smile on the whale's face, it only makes it creepy, right? So this is what we're doing with our kids back here right now. So sorry about that. But listen, Jonah and the whale is a story that's really important for everybody to hear, from kids all the way to adults, and here's why. Because it's not a story about a fish. It's actually a story about God's amazing love and grace to take a broken runaway named Jonah, turn him around, and use him to transform a whole city. The story is about God's unrelenting love for Jonah, for Nineveh, but it's also a story about you and me. And I believe until we find ourselves in this story, it's really going to be hard to let it change us. So that's my hope and prayer today. So Jonah, chapter 3 and 4 is where we're going to be. And I'm going to go through it kind of bit by bit, but give you my outline now. And here's what I want to tell you, that when it comes to reaching people for Christ, our neighbors or people in close proximity, I believe God uses three things that we will see right here in the book of Jonah. He uses your mess, his message, and a mirror. Your mess, his message, and a mirror. So let's dive into this. First of all, he uses your mess. Let's dive into this story. Remember, Jonah has just been spat out onto dry land. The second chance to go to Nineveh. Chapter 3, then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, 3 days' journey in breadth. That meant it took 3 days just to through the city. That's how big it was. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least of them. All right, skip down to verse 10. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Right? Listen, Jonah, straight out of the whale debacle, gets a second chance, goes to Nineveh, shares God's message, and it works. It works. The whole city, from the least to the greatest, completely turns from their evil and turns towards God. And it's this amazing story. Now, one of the questions that I want to have before I move on to the next part of the story is, what made Jonah's message so effective? What made his message so effective that the whole city begins to turn? Well, here's what I want you to know, that there's a lot of scholars that say probably one of the reasons Jonah's message was so effective is because of the last week of his life, going through the mess of the boat and the storm and the whale. That gave credibility to Jonah's message right out of the worst times in his life. And so in this passage, we don't see exactly all the things that Jonah said, but I can only imagine at times Jonah, when he's telling his story and the message of God, he's going, listen guys, this is what God says, and when God speaks, you should probably listen. You want me to tell you why? Just a week ago, right, or a few days ago, I ran the opposite direction, wanted nothing to do with God and what he wanted for me. I should be dead if it wasn't for a giant fish that swallowed me and then spit me back on the dry land. And he did it all so that you would hear this message. When God says something, he's serious, guys. And I have to believe that Jonah's complete disaster with the whale gave him the credibility to be able to have the Ninevehs hear a message and have it change their lives. I believe that's the way that God works. Is what he did is he took Jonah's mess of a life and he turned it upside down into a message that had the power to impact a whole city for God. Right? And that's the way he wants to work with you and me, is in the middle of our biggest messes of life, our biggest struggles, our biggest failures, our biggest messes, God wants to turn them into a message that he can use. And I see this all the time. We have a marriage ministry here called Re-Engaged. We launched it last fall. We'll launch it again here in the fall, but we had about 50 couples go through it, and God really worked through that ministry in some really cool ways. And if you're interested, you should jump in the fall. Shameless little plug. Right? But what I want you to know is when we do Reengage, we have to recruit a whole bunch of leader couples to lead. Now, the prerequisite to leading Reengage is not to have a perfect marriage. Because, first of all, there's no such thing. But the most effective leaders in Reengage are people who actually aren't perfect nor claim they're perfect, but are willing to actually admit they've had some messes in their marriage. And when they admit that to others, God turns that into a message that has the power to impact other couples. And it's amazing to watch. That's the power of what happens at Reengage. That's the power of anybody who's having an impact in this church right now. Ask them their story. I guarantee you there are messes involved. In some cases, major messes. And it has led them to a ministry or to a message that changes people's lives. As a pastor, one of the things that I have the privilege to do is to walk with people during some of the hardest times of life. That's what happens, and it's hard, but it's a privilege. And when they're going through hard times, it's interesting because I both feel really sad for people and want to walk with them and bear burdens, and at the same time, this is going to sound twisted, I get excited. The reason I get excited is because even though they can't see past the mess that their life is at that moment, God can. And God doesn't just see a mess. He not only wants to bring them out of that mess, but He actually has a ministry or a message that He wants to send through that person. Not without their mess, but because of their mess. And that's what I think you're seeing in Jonah. And this is why it happens. The reason it works this way is because this is the story of Jesus. Jesus turns a mess into a message for every single one of us. And I don't know if you realize this, but Jonah has a ton of parallels to the story of Jesus, to the gospel. I won't even say all of them. But look at Jonah spent, no coincidence, 3 days in the belly of a fish. Right? Jesus, when He died, spent 3 days in a tomb before He rose again. When Jonah was spit out onto dry land, God had used him with His message to transform a whole city. When Jesus resurrected from the dead, it ignited a movement that has been transforming people for thousands of years. The story of Jonah is the story of the gospel, and the gospel is this, that you and I were a mess. The best of us are a mess, but what God did is He came and sent Jesus down to offer grace and forgiveness so that we would be able to pull out of our mess and into new life because of Jesus. And not only that, He doesn't just want to pull us out. He actually has something for us to do. We are blessed to be a blessing. We have been a mess so that we would have a message that other people might hear and be impacted by. That's the beauty of the gospel. And so my first point here is God uses your mess. So back to the neighbors. We talk about reaching our neighbors for Christ and people in our close proximity. I think here's the next step for you. If you want to reach your neighbors for Christ, share your mess with them. Share your mess. You don't have to share it all, but share how you were a mess and how God brought you out of that. Don't share that you are this shiny, perfect, all-American family who goes to church, because that doesn't work. Nobody wants that. Nobody feels that. Everybody's a mess, and they want to know that you have been a mess too, but that Jesus wants to do something miraculous with your mess. All right? So first thing is that He wants to use your mess. Second is that He wants to use His message. Back to verses 4 and 5. It says this, Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest of them to the least of them. One of the things I want you to see in this is that it says for Nineveh, it was a huge city. It took 3 days for Jonah to get through the whole city to share this message. But notice what it says. After one day, he shares this message and everybody starts to change. And I love this. And the only thing that's recorded in this story that Jonah says is yet 40 days and Nineveh's going to be overthrown. That's all that's recorded. So we know Jonah probably said a lot more than just that. But I love that that's the only thing that's recorded, because the point is not what Jonah said. The point is the power behind the message that Jonah shared. It wasn't Jonah's message. It was God's message. And I want you to know that it's God's message that has the power to change people. It's not our message. It's God's. And I think, when it comes to challenging people to share their faith with others, to share the grace of Jesus with others, sometimes I hear this all the time, well, I'm not really good at that. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. I'm not really very eloquent, so I think I'll do other things. Well, here's what I want you to know. I get all that, and it's not an easy thing because it takes boldness, but God is not asking you to make up something. He's not asking you to figure out what to say. He's already said it. He already has a message, and His desire is just for you to take that message and share it. And what it says in here, I love this. When Jonah shared his message, it says the people believed God. The people believed God. It doesn't say the people believed Jonah. The people believed him because he was super convincing. It says the people believed. It's God's message, and it's God's work, and it's God's power, and He can do whatever He wants to do. All He wants us to do is simply take the message that has changed our lives and pass it on. It might stumble out. You might not say it as perfectly as you want to say it, but then let God do the rest. I think that's what He's calling us to do. Isaiah 55:11 says this, "So shall my word that goes forth from my mouth, it shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it." So we should never be surprised when people actually turn to God because we give them the message. Because what this says in Isaiah 55 is His word doesn't return empty. When you say it, it takes a response. And I believe with every single person needs to hear this message. And I think that's where we have to start. Nineveh was this great city. It says it was exceedingly great. I mean, economically great. It had everything going for this city. The problem was they were doing whatever they wanted to do, and so it was an evil city. And when Jonah came, it didn't take long for these people to realize that they were experiencing so much success and doing whatever they want, but it wasn't working for them. It was only making them empty and wanting more. And so they responded to the message. We shouldn't be surprised when anybody responds to the message, because we were made for this message. Right? God created us to be in relationship with Him. Jesus is the message every single person needs to hear. Right? Because we were made for it. And so we are not called to necessarily share some really cool thing with people that we have to make up. We're shared to call the message, to share the gospel of the message. We're called to share the message. I think our church in the last year and a half has been really fun to be a part of, because we've seen people giving their lives to Jesus for the first time. We've seen other people that have said, man, I have been reignited in my faith because of the messages that are preached here. And I want to tell you why that's happening. It's not because we are fancy. I just stumbled through that last sentence. It didn't even make sense to you, okay? We're not that good. We're not that eloquent. We're not this exceptionally talented church or anything like that. All we are doing here is simply taking a message that has transformed our lives and transformed lives for a couple thousands of years, and we're just holding it out to people and saying, hey, this is what you need. This is what you've always wanted. And it works. And it works. Jesus actually works. That's why this church is growing. And I want you to know that. And I think he uses all of us. It doesn't take a pastor, it just takes somebody willing to share the message. There was a guy, I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy, he lived a couple hundred years ago. His name is Edward Kimball. You ever heard of Edward Kimball? Didn't think so. Some of you are like, yes, I should know. No, I don't. Right? No, you really probably don't, because he wasn't a big deal at all. Edward Kimball was a Sunday school teacher in Boston. And the story goes that Edward Kimball had a passion to share the gospel message with people. And so he went to a young man's house in the Boston area to share the gospel one Saturday afternoon. And he showed up and he led this young man to Christ. This young man's name was D.L. Moody. Right? D.L. Moody, maybe more of you know. He was the greatest evangelist in the 19th century. He founded the college that I actually went to, which is kind of cool too. So he had an impact on me among so many other people. D.L. Moody, but here's the way the story goes. D.L. Moody ended up having a huge impact on a guy named Wilbur Chapman. Wilbur Chapman joined forces with a guy named Billy Sunday. They started doing these evangelistic kind of events. Billy Sunday then ended up partnering with a guy named Mordecai Ham. These two guys had an event one time in Charlotte, North Carolina, where they shared the gospel, and there was a man sitting in the audience who received Christ for the first time. That guy's name was Billy Graham. Right? Billy Graham, probably one of the greatest evangelists you've ever heard of in recent history. Some of you I've talked to that have received Christ at one of his events. It all traces back to Ed Kimball. Nobody ever heard of him. But Ed Kimball simply shared the message that God had. And D.L. Moody responded, and the rest is history. You never know the kind of impact that you can have by simply just sharing a gospel message with someone when the opportunity arises. So, there's a mess that you can share your mess, but you've got to share his message. And those two things combined are a 1-2 punch. They're powerful, right? Lastly, that leads me to my last point, which is that we also need a mirror. We also need a mirror. And I'll show you what I mean in a moment, but I believe Jonah would be an epic book. It is an epic book. It'd be a more epic book if it ended in chapter 3 and nothing ever happened in chapter 4. And you'll see what I mean in a moment, because what would be awesome is if Jonah ran from God, then the whale got him, spit him back up, came to Nineveh, preached, everybody got saved, and it was the end, happily ever after. And actually, most of the time in Sunday school classes, that's all you hear. Some of you might think that's the end of the story, but it's actually not. The story gets kind of weird and hard to read in chapter 4. But it's important because I think it's one of the most relatable parts of the story, or parts of the Bible, I should say. So, chapter 4. Now, keep this in mind. God had just used Jonah to save a whole city. Greatest revival to date. And listen to this, chapter 4. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. Feels like a typo. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was in my country? This is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew, listen to this, for I knew that you were a gracious and God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and unrelenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? It's like the greatest statement of the year. I can't believe this. You look at Jonah and you see his response. Now listen, one of the reasons that Jonah's responding this way is because Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Assyria was one of the most evil places at that time, and they were an enemy of Israel, Jonah's people. And so Jonah only knew Nineveh as this horrible place doing horrible things, and they were. They were the worst of the worst. And so Jonah thought God was just going to have him send this message, but God would still destroy them because that's what they deserved. And so Jonah could not accept the fact that God actually was going to forgive this evil people and show compassion to them. Jonah didn't understand just how powerful God's love could be. And I sometimes think we don't either. One of the questions I would have for you today is, there's somebody in your life who you think is not deserving of God's love, who you think is just too far gone. Maybe another way to say it is this: how would you respond if you found out those people gave their lives to Jesus and were transformed? How would you respond? Let me give you some names just to kind of like hopefully make it real. We'll go back in history a little bit. What if you found out that before he died, Adolf Hitler gave his life to Christ? Like, right? We're like, whoa, hey, now. Right? What if Osama bin Laden? Some of these people that so far from God, enemies of God. But let's make it more real, because those are big names and it's easy to be shock and awe with those. Right? What about the person who has deeply wounded you and you hope that you never have to see their face again? What about that person? What about the person that, is your neighbor that disagrees with everything, that calls the HOA on every little move that you do or whatever? Like, you just can't even stand them, don't want you go in your house when they come out. What about that person? Is it in our minds that there are certain people that we just hope will go away, or do we actually have the ability to say that those people are people that God desires to actually save and redeem and rescue? That when He says that I'm not willing that anyone should perish, but I want everyone to come to eternal life. We have to change our perspective sometimes, and I know it's hard. Jonah didn't understand just how powerful God's love is. I think that oftentimes we don't understand just how powerful God's love can be. Now, the story goes on where God is trying to teach Jonah a little bit of a lesson here. So I want to read the rest of this story, Jonah 4, verses 5 to 11. Jonah went out of the city, sat up at the east of the city, and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be shade over his head, to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die, and said, "It is better for me to die than to live." Just keeps complaining. But God said to Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry for the plant?" And Jonah said, "Yes, I do well to be angry enough to die." And the Lord said, "You pity the plant, for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in the night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" That's the end. That part about the cattle is kind of weird. We won't go into that. But when I read this, I start to get amazed by how patient God is with Jonah. So patient. He has I feel like God has every right to be like, "Okay, Jonah, we're done here. You want to die? Bam." And I find myself reading this and getting frustrated with Jonah. As I read through this, I'm like, wait a second, Jonah, is this what you're saying? That God wanted you to do something, you ran away, miraculously God saved you using a fish, you didn't want to listen, you would have rather died than to listen to God, but God saved you anyway, spit you back up onto dry land, and sent you to Nineveh, used you to transform a whole city, and you're mad about it. And not only are you mad about it, but now we're at this place where you are just complaining about everything. You're sitting out of the city and you're like, I'm hot. And God's like, okay, here's some shade. And then he takes the shade away and he's hot again. And he's so hot that he's angry enough to die. And he's like a victim here. How many times in Jonah does Jonah say, I want to die? He's like, it's amazing. And I look at this and I go, God has every reason to just snap his fingers and go, Jonah, I am done with you. But he doesn't. And as I get frustrated with Jonah, it dawns on me that I am just like Jonah. Right? Jonah is frustrated, doesn't think Ninevites are worthy of God's love. And what I'm implying right now is maybe Jonah isn't worthy of God's love and patience. But then I realize now I am not worthy of God's love and patience. Right? That's God's amazing love. And I don't get it. Jonah doesn't get it. Jonah didn't think the Ninevites were worthy. Right? I didn't think Jonah was worthy, and I know that I'm not worthy of God's love. I have no business being loved by God, much less being used by God. I think when you read the Bible, the reason I said in this point that it's a mirror is because when you read the Bible, you need to read it like it's a mirror. The Bible's not a book that's like a history book. It's a mirror that actually shows you more about yourself than you ever want to see. When you read the book of Jonah, what you're seeing is you. If you get frustrated with Jonah, you should get frustrated with yourself, because the book of Jonah is like holding up a mirror to you. And when you look in the mirror, the person that's staring back at you is one who has no business being loved by God, much less being used by God. That's the book of Jonah. And I think we all have to hold up the mirror. When it comes to reaching our neighbors for Christ, when it comes to reaching that person that is so hard to love, what we need to do is wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and realize the person staring back at us is no more deserving or worthy of God's love than anybody else in our neighborhood or in the world. We are all sinners in need of a Savior, and when we start to see it that way, we will grow more compassionate heart towards those who are lost, towards those who don't know their right hand from their left, because that's God's heart. We will start to see people like Jesus sees them. And at that point, we will start to make an impact, the people around us. God uses your mess, His message, and oftentimes a mirror. And I hope today that we would leave this place excited to deliver God's message to people. And let's see what He does.